from Cape Town. My name is Veronica Osorio, and I will be the guest host of AEN podcast, the 10th conference. I'm very happy to be here. My name is Veronica Osorio-Calderon. I'm from Bolivia, and I am the researcher in UCL at the Epicenter. And today I will interview a friend of mine, someone who I admire a lot, Andrea Ordonez. She is the co-founder of the Southern Voice, a network of think tanks across Africa, Latin America, and Asia. So welcome, Andrea.
Thank you, Veronica, and it's great to have this conversation
Yes.
today. We were going to have it in Spanish.
Yes, we wanted to have this conversation in Spanish, but not today.
Not today, but next time.
Next time.
Okay.
So, Andrea, it's nice to see you, that we get together again in one of these important events about to talk about evidence. So let me know how you get involved. Let us know how you get involved on this journey on the evidence, on policy making, and all this in the Southern Hemisphere. What motivated you to go to in this area?
So I've always been in the specific sub area of think tanks and research organizations that produce evidence very targeted to policymakers. And I joined a very young think tank back in Ecuador, right out of my master's. And I never left the sector. I'm one of those strange animals that have been in this sector for a really long time, instead of like coming through a coincidence, coming through another missed opportunity or another adventure or so on. But it was really interesting for me to just see that there's a lot of opportunities to improve policy if you can have information, data, evidence shared with policymakers, but at the same time that it's really difficult, the job that they do. And they have a lot of constraints and a lot of limitations that sometimes we don't acknowledge when we're thinking about policy. And as citizens, we're like, oh, why doesn't this work? And it's like, yeah, it's quite difficult to change something. So I think that has been a little bit my career. And so I began there. And then some years in, then through a gathering with other think tanks across the Global South, the idea of creating this network of Southern Voice came about. And the idea was there's so many organizations in the Global South producing valuable evidence for their local context, but then we wanted to have an opportunity to bring this evidence to the global debates. And at that time, the discussion was what is going to come after the Millennium Development Goals. We didn't know that they were going to be called the SDGs there. And then we started saying, instead of having a couple of people in New York define these goals, shouldn't they be better informed by local knowledge and evidence? And that's how Southern Voice came about, and where I've been in the last 11 years.
11 years.
Yeah.
So you are already like one of the most recognized experts in the region and in the Global South. So how do you explain the term evidence-informed decision-making to someone who doesn't know, who is not involved in this area?
Well, I think I don't try to explain that term.
So
I think the work is about trying to make the best of knowledge for the decision-making process, right? And yeah, we give it this name, and this name changes and it varies depending on who. But I think when you're talking to the taxi driver or to someone in a cafe, they say, there's this knowledge that is out there that can be used to improve policy. I think people generally get the sense that's interesting. Yeah.
And have you seen some improvement through this last decade on the Southern Voice in the involvement globally?
I think so. I think it's very contextual, and it is evolving. It's very evolving. But I think that's why institutions are very important, and building institutions that do this work, such as think tanks but others, are very important, right? So many times what we've seen is that for evidence to get into policy, you need time, you need to be there at the right moment. And so, but you've been building this for ages, right? So let me tell you now, for example, Bangladesh, right? They've had a recent, they've had this change of government. They had a very authoritarian government there. Think tanks and other organizations doing work around evidence were really constrained of what they could do for, a decade, over a decade. And they were struggling. They were doing their best to try to find ways around it, but with many constraints. But now they've had the opportunity, right? And now there's this engagement of a lot of them in defining the white paper for the new economy of the country and designing new things of how a new government can work, new engagement with civil society. But it's not like that can happen out of nowhere. You need the institutions that are already there doing kind of the work. But it really depends on the politics many times.
In the politics? So how come?
in the politics, because many times you have like governments that are like unwilling to listen. They're really interested in, but particularly authoritarian governments on any side of the spectrum of like not having any sort of independent voices and so on.
It's so interesting how what you're talking right now, because it brings me the question if you actually have witnessed some successful case on the use of evidence when this timing was favorable and they could actually have the political willingness, the civil society engaged, and the evidence there, and it actually worked for something. Do you have or you remember something specifically that could happen in the global south?
Well, I think that there are different examples of that. For example, we have colleagues in Argentina, in CIPEC, that's a think tank in Argentina, that have been working on promoting parental care, like for fathers to have time off. And it's a lot of work, right? You need a lot of campaigning. They did public campaigning around this. But you start seeing improvements, right? But then the tricky part is that you don't know with these shifts in policy, in the politics, how long are these things going to last or so on. So I think there are good examples of what can be done, and moments also when things can start to change.
I read somewhere that, for example, there are moments like previous an election, for example, that are like good timing to push or advocate for something. Or so, what would you think is according to your experience of what you have seen, that could be a good timing to plan on doing some action, as collective?
Well, definitely elections are a really good time. I think a lot of the member organizations from Southern Voice use the time around elections to position new ideas. Also trying to frame issues less political, so that different parties can relate to it and include it in their agendas as well. Of course, there are also like partisan think tanks that do just specific targeting, but it's a good moment to put something in the agenda and try to get some early commitments from potential politicians to do something. So it's definitely a good time. Sometimes also depending on the budget cycle, right? That's another time where things can be very informative, because when you're deciding what to cut, what not to cut, what to do with miracle funding, windfall tax that you have from, like in Bolivia, extractives, or in Ecuador as well, or other things like that. That's also a really good time to try to get things discussed, because at the end of the day, the government needs money to do things, right? And so when those discussions are happening, that's another time when it's good to bring up evidence.
So from now on, what do you think are the following steps that we have? How do you envision the future in the Global South according to the work you've been doing in Southern Voices?
Well, I think part of the challenges right now for the work around evidence-based policy is around how do we fund this work more consistently, right? So for a lot of the work around evidence-based policy, we rely on international cooperation. And there is a problem with that. One problem is that as the geopolitics change, I think that's also going to be a challenge for organizations. So organizations working in this space need to think strategically about how to fund themselves and place themselves so that they're not seen as being a geopolitical actor, right? It's not unseen that you get called by your government for being, bringing an external agenda into your country. I think you can probably relate. So that's definitely one thing to look into as a concern. The other one is sustainability, right? Ideally, we would want more local actors, the government, local private sector, and others to be financing this work more. And I think there's a huge gap there for the sector.
That brings me something that was mentioned in this conference from one of the funders, saying that sometimes the countries don't have the capacities, no? I think it was mentioned the first day that they don't, we were talking about artificial intelligence, I think, and they said, no, yeah, it's interesting because we would love to support artificial intelligence in the Global South, but there is no capacity, no? And so we cannot do that there. What do you think about this kind of, because it's tricky because we want the funding, but at the same time we could be limited at some points in some aspects.
Yeah, I think that, I think it depends on what the funders want to accomplish. I think that if funders want to accomplish a real change into having a global ecosystem, then those investments have to be complete, right? I mean, and maybe it's also important to take into account the pace of change, right? So you need to acknowledge that there are these digital gaps, of course. But we also know that bringing in new technologies just like that can also increase the disparity.
Totally.
And we've seen that in all other things around technologies, right? So in a sense, I don't buy it. I think that if they were really interested, then you have to find the funding to cover it all or find the partnerships to be able to do so.
Well, thank you very much. That was very insightful. Thank you. And
thank you, Veronica. Great to have this conversation in Cape Town.
Yes, and so from South America, Ecuador, and Bolivia. Thank you very much.
Thank you.